Hello, everybody, and welcome to another BAPT in Conversation with webinar. My name is Richard Owen. I'm a board member of the British Association for Psychological Type. This is one of the things I help organise, and we've also got the conference coming up in April in Milton Keynes, again in the UK. Another great international lineup of speakers about psychological type and associated subjects. So really looking forward to that. Do go to bapt.org.uk and have a look and sign up if you haven't already. Great to welcome today one of our distinguished guests from the United States, a member of the type community who has published multiple books, runs a number of different companies, works as a consultant in leadership and a coach, has consistently been a strong voice in the support of psychological type, a previous president of the APTI, no less as well. So just want to welcome Roger Pearman.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and nice to know that we have folks stretched out across the world. That's always exciting. This technology has made it possible to have conversations that just a decade ago would have had to rely on a phone and a conference call number. So I love this technology. I spent a lot of time on it working with people in different places. So it's good to be with you.
Great. So thanks for joining us, Roger. And I just want to start off with a bit of stuff about your background, and maybe you can let us know, like when did you, or how did you first get involved with psychological type and MBTI? Where did that all begin?
Well, nearly right at 50 years ago, when I was a university freshman, the school required all freshmen to go through a series of introductory assessments and career workshops and things of that nature. And the Career Center at my university used at the time a research form F of the MBTI. And as a part of your freshman experience, you then attended a little small group where the data of the tools you had taken were interpreted, and you had a chance to ask questions and think about how to use this information. And like many people in those days when type was coming out through the MBTI, I had that absolutely astonishing moment of realization that here was someone describing the leanings of my mind's eye and describing certain elements of psychological experience through a little questionnaire and an interpretation of that questionnaire, which ignited immediately an interest in finding out, well, where did this come from and what was this about? And as a student, I began to read Jung's works and to study not only in my own course of studies from time to time, but also on my own. I was very curious about this thing called type. And that curiosity carried into graduate school, where I began to have a variety of internships where the psychological services centers used the MBTI as a part of the services we provided, as a way of helping us understand the client and the client understand us, and us talk about our languaging and how that languaging could be different based on the fact that our typology could be different. And of course, that naturally led to questions about, well, what if? And I attended a small group that was a network at the time. APT did not exist. And there was a network of folks who kind of knew each other. We were a scattered family talking about, well, gosh, I used the indicator with this group of students, and this is what I learned, and I gathered data. I was particularly interested in learning tactics and learning strategies, and I'd gathered a lot of data. Gordon Lawrence and I got connected, and we talked about his work, and he was working on the first manuscript of People Types and Tiger Stripes, and there were others who were doing research, and I was in higher ed too. So anyway, there was this bubbling of ongoing curiosity and interest around the use of type. And I wrote some initial papers. I did one on type and reading, and then type and learning styles, and did a major retention study for college, and was able to show students leaving in good academic standing how it is their type usually, if you will, didn't fit with the dynamics of the culture, because what that type needed was not being represented. And I could go into detail on that, but you asked a sweeping question.
So in terms of like, well, this was when you started off. What was the sort of reception to type in this academic world and in the business world at the time?
Well, at the time, if we think about it, in those days, psychology had the MMPI, the 16PF, and the CPI 440. CPI had 440 questions. And it was thought of as clinical. So we create a column and we just call it clinical. There really wasn't anything other than the MBTI, which we could put in the category of developmental. Now, the 16PF and the CPI could be used to encourage a developmental conversation, but there was always a barrier between the results and the way the results were interpreted and the client. And all the reports were highly clinical based reports. I mean, when you read, even though Harrison Goff created the CPI to be a report on normal adult development, it still had clinical elements to it. So the MBTI came out as this new tool, which, apologize, I thought I had turned that off. Now it is. New tool, which would get individuals to think about themselves. And before, we have to remember, and it's so hard to get this historically correct, we didn't have the evidence that we do today that self-awareness is a cornerstone of development. And we didn't have the evidence that we do today that beginning to understand how your mind works and how you may or may not impact the world around you is going to be vital to being effective in the organizational context that people might find themselves. So before the MBTI was used in organizations, it was used mostly by counselors, ministers, mostly used in those what I'd call personal help settings, family and marriage counseling situations. In fact, the research form F I took had been mostly used by the Catholic Church in the United States, where priests were using it as part of their counseling with individuals and families. I only know that because when I got initially excited in using type and helped create APT, and that time we had regional vice presidents. I was a vice president responsible for the Southeast of the United States to help get groups started, chapters started, and do things like that. We would get the publisher to tell us who's using this besides us. And APT at the time, I would say when we became an organization in 79, 95% of the folks who were members were counselors, therapists, very, very small people from the corporate world were a part of the community at that time, and a lot of academic folk who were curious about this thing called type. And even though the Big Five model, the Big Factor model, five-factor model, had raised its head a little bit here and there over a couple of decades, it didn't have the presence that it has today. And I think the following statement's important too. It had been declared by one of the most widely respected psychologists, research psychologists in the United States at the time, that personality is dead, that the study of personality is a dead endeavor. He had come to the conclusion that there was no such thing as personality. Human beings were so socially interactive and their changes were so socially driven and contextually driven that, researching personality was a wasted effort. Well, we know that changed by the early 80s when enough researchers began to publish and say, oh, let me say there's something else going on here that we can call personality, which is the persistence of patterns over time and across contexts and situations. So to your question, my excitement initially as a student and that discovery of myself and thinking this would be a good thing for other people, my use of it in clinical settings clearly showed that I could help students become better students. And then when I left the academic world and went into the corporate world, I was able to use type as a way to help managers be better managers. And by the time I started doing that, there were other people beginning to do that sort of thing and that sort of use. And many of us would say that we weren't necessary. Those of us in that early group, I wouldn't say we were necessarily happy with Form G. And the reason for that, of the MBTI at the time, the reason for that was Form F contained all of the items that Isabel Myers considered important to explore for type development. And those items had gone through multiple tests over time, and they had become the set of items that she found to be most useful for tapping into development patterns and issues. And in multiple conversations with Mary McCauley and Naomi Quink and others at the time, we began to look at those patterns and became aware that, of course, she had a scoring system for what she referred to as sufficiency scales. And those scales eventually, through various permutations, became what we now call step 2. And there's a long history to that too as well, which is an interesting story. But at any rate, she had been scoring for the sufficiency scales since 1963, 64, and had a great deal of data over, she was such an enormously, she was very curious about things. And so she had written people all over the country who had taken the MBTI to get their health records. So she could look at patterns, health patterns across the types. And she had, by the time she died, she had an enormous amount of data on the types and health issues and health patterns, which hasn't really seen the light of day, except in the most recent step 3 report. Some of that material has slid in there and is being used, written differently than the way she wrote it. But nonetheless, to your question, that excitement about its use, its personal impact, and then the realization how useful it could be with other people, which has been very much a passion of mine throughout all of my career, is really helping individuals become the best learner they could be. I have a massive bias about learning. That is to say, it's a continual, ongoing process, and the more tactics we use more frequently, the more we learn, and the more we're able to adapt to an incredibly dynamic and changing world. So throughout every single endeavor in my life, whether it was personal exploration and personal growth, to all of the career opportunities I've had to work inside of organizations, in my companies, type has been a very helpful friend. Type has been a very good friend. Now, having published a lot and taken a public role with type a lot, I have been called upon to defend it as other tools came along that were in competition, and then others who criticized type who didn't really understand it. And it's still the case that whenever I'm invited into a conversation about type with well-educated, well-informed people who have concluded that type has no, quote, scientific basis, end quote, I usually find it's not about type they're responding to. It's not about the theory. It's not about what we might think. It's typically about other forms of bias against what typology is attempting to do. And regrettably, and I'll never forget it, Mary McCauley said to me one time, she said, you know, the bigger we get, meaning the use of type, the more we become the focus of attack.
Mm.
And of
Let's
course,
talk about that. I mean, this is one of the key things really that we want to speak about is this. I know what's at the root of sort of, let's call it a misunderstanding, I suppose, or different perspectives on personality, and why is it that the trait lens of personality appeals to people in a way and seems to then conflict with type as a general approach to personality?
well, let me come at your question in a couple of levels. One is very difficult to discern the veracity of the claim I'm about to make, but I'm going to make it anyway. All of my colleagues in psychology, as best I can tell, have been thoroughly trained in what I will call a kind of linear measurement truth, meaning if you can show a relationship between one item or another, or in a relationship between a factor, an inverse relationship with another factor, and that's still linear, meaning there's a dance the two are doing, that they're connected. If you can show that, then that must be something that's true. And the biases around what good science is inherently do not account for the kind of complexity that type proposes exists. Number one. Number two, because it's difficult to verify some of the type propositions in the same way that others have tried to verify other claims about personality, it seems to be an outlier, and therefore it's not robust. Third factor is type, as the way it's come to people through the MBTI, has come under the guise that, and I'll steal Isabel Meyer's statement when she was in front of the only joint American Medical Association and American Psychological Association conference in history, and she presented data. She said, the MBTI is about what is right with people, not what is wrong. And that frame of trying to empower individuals and to invite them on a journey, she never thought, nor did Jung, as best I can tell, ever thought that just because you settled on what your type was, that somehow it's done, the story's done. It never was her proposition, and never was his proposition, again, as best I can discern from all of the letters and all the books and the things that I've read. And I find that because type has this outlier framing, that it seems anathema to what, quote, true psychology and personality is all about. Now, I find it interesting, because I follow this research and have all my professional career, that the current movement in personality is not about traits. The current movement in personality, in terms of the research in personality, is much more about the processes, the cognitive processes that result in the patterns of behaviors, and not necessarily assuming an inherent trait bias. And now I know the traits, people, they're at their highest peak at the moment, and they're celebrating that in all kinds of ways. But in fact, the key researchers in personality have really gone on to take a look at some other factors that are far more complicated and far more type-like. Shouldn't surprise us that people who've been into the big data analysis, you probably, all of you who are here, saw that a report that came out that golly wow, there are personality types based on our massive 1 million plus people database from taking the big five. And if you get into that data pattern, if you look at their actual reports, it's more than just the personality types they initially identified when they wrote that article that got published all over the world. Got published in Time Magazine, got published in The Guardian, got published in all kinds of places. So here's a story of what's happened to me many, many times. After the 1994 edition of the revision of the MBTI, which used item response analysis, and I was on the research panel that did that work. For many, many years, I was on the research board for CPP, now the Myers-Briggs company. Well, I would be invited to be a part of a panel. This has happened at several universities, and the Big Five was just beginning. The Neo had just been released and with big fanfare and was getting attention inside of the psychological communities and academic communities. Then I would be invited to a panel to talk about, poor old MBTI and its relative weakness. And I'll never forget this was about 1997, 1998. Big auditorium, lots of people interested in personality and psychology, and I was the only panel member who had been invited to defend the MBTI. And so I asked the audience after I was introduced, I said, I'm curious, how many of you as scientists believe that IRT is our best bet at getting at underlying attributes, that is our strongest driving mechanism to date as scientists? Oh yeah, it's the hot stuff, man. If you can do an IRT analysis, you are head and shoulders above everybody else. And I went on to say, how many personality tools do you know, or personality related tools do you know, have used IRT to help revise it or help get it sort of re-examined as a model and as a tool? And of course, they all said, well, nobody has done that. And I said, well, actually, the MBTI has. And the room was dead silent. One psychologist said, I don't think so. I think you must be talking about something else. I said, no. I said, you can go buy a new manual if you want to, and you can see IRT was used. And if it's the case that an IRT analysis gives us enough fire to say there's something going on here that's worth paying attention to, don't you think that in comparing it to another tool that's based on old psychometric mechanisms, that maybe it merits some revision in your view? And so I've had that conversation. I can't tell you the times over the years since that where people will, honest, earnest, well-meaning, kind, thoughtful researchers are absolutely astonished to learn that the MBTI had a version that went through IRT. And now the most recent redo is using latent theory of analyzing the items, and came out essentially with the same patterns and things that we've known. So what I've tried to do whenever I've had a personal opportunity with a group who are anti-MBTI or anti-type, I've tried to say to them, well, let's ask ourselves, if we're really interested in science, what do we hold to be true about the best mechanisms to measure for that and look for that? And do the tools you claim are the best? Do they match up to that? And let's compare it to the MBTI. Other audiences they love to stand up and say, the reliability just sucks. It's just not a good tool. It's unreliable. I go, well, back up. If we agree that reliability coefficients by scale is a good measure, and I put up on the screen the reliability, test-retest reliability for the Neo and test-retest reliability for the MBTI, and they look almost exactly alike. The one's not any better than the other. They sort of, with their mouths wide open. So, well, why do people keep saying it's so unreliable? I say, well, that's a good question. Why is it that people keep telling things when it's unbased, just simply not at all based on any sort of numerical analysis of looking at the manuals, which should be foundational if you're going to critique or make some sort of critical statement about a tool. The most recent article, the personality brokers, early in the book, in fact, I think even in the preface, she says, as quote, as is well known, the MBTI is scientifically unfounded. And yet nowhere in the book does she attempt to talk about the basis of that conclusion, how that conclusion was made, but does make a point to pull out some old research of old critics without looking at the contemporaries of that time who also produced supporting data. As I often say to everybody, the MBTI is certainly not perfect. And the MBTI has the same measurement problems every personality tool on the planet has. There's nothing that escapes in terms of psychometric value, the challenges and the benefits of a tool like the MBTI. I said, however, what the MBTI gives you is a potential inquiry about how you approach things and how you might approach things, how you use mental resources and how you might use the mental resources to enrich your life. And none of the other personality tools do that. They always tell you what your score is, what's wrong with it, or what might be overly right with it and what you do to fix it. Where the MBTI is not into that conversation. So it's been an interesting journey to follow the criticisms. And I have right now, for example, colleagues who every time there's an article written that's critical of the MBTI, they shove it in front of me and say, well, what do you think about this one? And then I talk them through it and I say, well, let's look at the evidence. And I point out to them, I'm not claiming that this tool is somehow, as a tool, as an assessment tool, is inherently better or worse than any other well-developed tools. That's not the issue. What is always true about a tool is how well it's interpreted. James Newman made a statement one time. He was a researcher and writer and a faculty member who's no longer with us. He made the statement one time that I thought was beautiful. He said, you know, the problem with the MBTI is that it's a Stradivarius that people play like a dime store violin. And I think he was right about that the way in which the tool gets used has led to much of the criticism. When you start unwrapping it, even the personality brokers, when you start unwrapping the criticism, it's really about how it gets used, how it gets applied, and not applied very well, not used in the constructive dynamic for which it was intended. So I know that's probably a whole lot more than you were looking for.
So, I mean, there's a lot of points there. I mean, what you've raised as an important one is that, as you said, it was in the late 90s, the IRT was brought in to redevelop Form M, the newer version of the MBTI, and that effectively took on and solved a lot of the problems that it was criticized for before that point. Yes, I mean, it was that. So a lot of those criticisms are still raised, not being aware that the whole thing was redesigned.
And has been redesigned as it just released a new psychometric framing with new data, new groups around the world. But yes, I always love this one. Well, it was developed by a housewife who knew nothing about personality. And I go, well, that's interesting. That's an interesting proposition. We've got lots of examples of people who created things outside of their discipline that were extraordinary. And I said, the problem with that is, as of 1994, that's no longer true. The instrument was taken apart. It was analyzed in the largest collection of data ever attempted. It was analyzed by the most powerful statistical engine ever attempted. And it was a panelist of 5 of us with doctoral degrees who went through and sorted and helped make decisions and recommendations for how it would look. I said, so you can take all of that stuff about a housewife and all that stuff about all that business as criticism that she didn't know what she was doing, and forget it, because that no longer is a part of the story in terms of the tool as you see it now.
Mm. And do you
So
think
right.
maybe is one of the problems that although the design of the tool itself was on a scientific level was radically changed and redesigned, did that news get out there? Was the marketing or PR response enough to actually make people aware of that fact?
Well, I'm going to make a statement that's going to get me in serious trouble. And this is an observation of history. Back in the early 80s, when we were forming APT, which became APTI, we had a serious debate on, to be good stewards of type, should we make the association an association of professionals and researchers who would be committed to the ongoing inquiry, just as Isabel Myers existed as she did in her life, to make serious inquiry with scientific tools into the nature of type and how it can benefit individuals and society? Or should we be an interest organization that allows people who are excited about type and want to celebrate type and get together and talk about type to be the organization? And of course, we now know it was the second that won the day.
Yeah.
What should have happened, and I am using a should, I did my best to scream at the top of the mountains about this, is that both the publisher and the association should have set aside funds to find serious researchers and support them in their endeavors to gather data over time about type, its application, and its utility. And that did not happen. Research that was published was serendipitous. And CAPT, is delightfully proud of any paper that gets published, and we can access it through the library. But what's happened is, because we did not systematically approach that and build a chest of knowledge over time based on sound measurement and research mechanisms, we wind up today criticized because there's not the foundational base that other tools have. We make claims about its utility about which we have no evidence. And so it's my view that this could have been easily foreseen, that we needed a library of sound research to support this tool that would become a worldwide avenue for self-awareness and self-discovery. And even if we relegate it to a simple questionnaire of interest, it still provides people with a moment of self-affirmation and a moment of thinking about, holy mackerel, you mean my significant other might be responding to me out of a whole different worldview? Well, that just blows people's minds. I just last week I sat with a group of executives who were going, oh my word, this explains why this argument with my spouse for the last 20 years has been ended. Now, whether or not that's true or not, it is an interesting question. What's interesting, though, is they, for the first time, have this way of framing the difference, such that I'm going to use one of my book titles, such that, oh, I'm not crazy and neither is she or he. and it's refreshing and inspiring and empowering in that way. But we also know it's been widely abused. It's been abused by organizations using it to place people in jobs and to make wild declarations. Well, you're a sensing type, so you'll never be able to do X, Y, Z. And that's a load of hooey. Amongst my friends, I use more flavorful language. but it's interesting to me that we had the opportunity to build the scientific momentum, and that opportunity was lost. Now, is it lost forever? No, I think not. I think as things go along, if we can ever get ourselves serious about providing the science argument. Now, that being said, we have to make a real distinction between the MBTI and Jung, and not confuse the two, and not confuse that the MBTI and Jung are, uniquely one-to-one in correspondence, because that is not true. And it's further not true that they're in any way, shape, or form synonymous with the framing of the way we might see ourselves and might learn from having that different mindset. But
this is where, Roger, sorry to interrupt. I'm just aware we've only got a couple of minutes left, 40. We've got one question here from Ian. I was wondering if you can quickly address that. It says, what are your thoughts about it, I guess, as in type being a money-making business?
There's several things, I think, about the whole question of money and in this case, type. I know in the most recent book, The Personality Brokers, she argues that it was all to try to create a new snake oil to get as much money from people as possible. And that revisionist history, I think, is really unsuitable for what the real motive was and the real behavior and all those kinds of things that Myers, how she exhibited that. Anybody who creates a product and who makes that product available has a right to earn some recognition of that product. Now, I personally think that, unfortunately, currency is the mechanism of value. And there's no question that you need financial resources in order to both refine, continue, support, all that kind of stuff. So I think that there's no inherent, crisis related to money coming from the use of type and how type gets used. What is a moral crisis, in my mind, is the lack of commitment to ongoing research in substantial ways, not just about the tool, but about the application of the tool. I mean, it used to be the most exciting conversations we had at APT were about how the tool had been used and data had been collected to let us see from the perspective of type what the various consequences were in the use of type. One study I'll never forget, the teacher had gotten into type and she collected data on her kids before the year started, before they took the indicator, on their self-esteem and on their approach to life and their orientation toward life. And at the end of the year, she had integrated type throughout the year, and the differences were absolutely staggering in terms of the kids' views of their capabilities and who they were and their sense of identity and all those kinds of factors. And to me, that's extremely exciting, and that's the kind of stuff we should be committed to and doing more of.
Yeah,
you can only do that when you support.
So wrap up, sorry, I know you're also undertaking some research yourself. So just as a final point, just a little bit about that, and also, what you think is necessary to change the tide, so to speak, on the academic world. What would it take to win back the popularity of type for academics?
Yeah, I decided to put my efforts in real time and resources to try to prepare a piece that can be widely published that says, look, it's not just about self-report, it's about what people observe. And here's how they fit together. We've got people all over the world and would love to have more people freely giving, through a little permission piece, giving their type data and letting some people rate them. And it's at absolutely no cost, no charge. And I'm happy to send the report to people who do it. My hope is to have several thousand people do this so that a paper can be published that says, look, from around the globe, we have this massive population of people who reported, this is what I believe is true of me, and the observers around them saw these behaviors, and we can see there's congruence. And already the initial show of data that we've looked at is beginning to show, just as we would expect, the behaviors that are most associated, let's say, with extroverted intuition are attached to the person who believes they're ENFP or ENTP, for example.
Mm.
So that, and I hope you'll spread that word, and I'm happy to send out that information. You can post it and do whatever. I plan to collect data for the next several months before we do an analysis on it. So that is indeed an effort to try to attend to the very thing I just complained about.
Right.
Your other question is how to turn the tide. Now,
yes, go on. We need to hear this last bit because it's important.
Yeah, we have got to engage in conversation to hear the assumptions and the biases and respond to those in a knowledgeable way, to provide the support to the science of the tool. And we need to find ways to encourage serious-minded researchers who can do rigorous analysis of behavior patterns and impact statements about the use of a tool like type in comparison to other tools. It's going to take, and it's a slow slog. There's no quick fix here, and I hope that more and more people will do that. Though I know most people have been, that there are now doctoral committees that will not approve MBTI studies. They're master's level faculty that will not approve MBTI studies. So it's going to take not just academics, but practitioners who have know-how and credibility in doing research to get more of that published and out there and discussed, in order for us to get more people at least reasonably inclined to consider, well, there must be some fire there that's worth our attention if we want to really push this forward.
Well, so Roger, I'm really sorry we're going to have to stop here. It's really fascinating stuff. I would like to continue on for longer, but we've got to stop the webinar as we planned. So we do look out for your publishing of your results from your research into observer ratings of type, and that's something I hope you share with us. If you email me the link to your study, I'll share that with this video as well. We'll have to get you back again to further discuss the topic. It's been really a pleasure to speak with you. Well,
thank you so much for the invitation. It was very kind and thoughtful of you to be interested in this old man's view. And I appreciate it, and let me know at any time if I can contribute to the cause.
Of course, no, it's a really pleasure to have your opinions heard, and we look forward to seeing you again. So thanks again. Thanks, Roger. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.